Professor Londu Nyegwe sends his regrets. He wished he could be here. He's actually at the United Nations advising the UN on the current state of the Sustainable Development Goals, something we're going to talk about today, so it's with good reason. And we'll try to pick up the thread of what he would have talked about, and then I'm going to add my own twist on education towards the end. So before I get started, how many of you are undergrads? Just can I see a show of hands? Are you all natural sciences? Can I see a show of hands? Natural social sciences? Anyone thinking about pursuing development as a career or a major? Some, okay, a few of you. All right, that helps me sort of orient myself to where you all are coming from. So today, I'm going to talk about development inequality and specifically use education as a case study to talk about how development policy has evolved over time and how inequality has many different faces. So we're going to start at the very high level, talking about the different theories of growth that sort of have driven development practice and policy for the last 40, 50 years. Then we're going to talk about the state of global inequality as it looks roughly today at the high level. And then we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into how global policy has evolved. And in particular, looking at how global policy around education and education goals have evolved. And then at the end, I'll share with you a micro view of the research that I'm currently doing in East Africa on girls' education practice and how that relates to the broader policy processes that are currently underway with the Sustainable Development Goals. So first, the growth paradigm. For the last 50 years, more or less, development practice has been dominated by this idea, right, that economic growth is what's going to reduce poverty. And generally, that's still the place we are, although the theories have evolved over time. The policy implications of focusing on growth are really threefold. One, most policy up till now has focused on removing barriers to economic growth, and there have been different iterations of how we think that might happen that have changed from decade to decade, and I'll talk about that briefly next. Two, economic development is really viewed as a technical rather than social or political problem. And for that reason, and this is no longer as true as it once was, but for a long time, students of development were really encouraged to focus on the natural sciences and develop the sort of technical fixes that might aid in economic growth rather than the social sciences. So in the 1970s and 80s, we saw the growth paradigm really focus on classical and neoclassical economic growth models, right? This is the classic free market argument that our job in order to promote growth is to remove barriers to free markets through removing tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade. Generally, we talked about the privatization of public goods and government divestment from social and economic safety nets. And we saw those types of policies really deployed all over the developing world. In the 1990s and early 2000s and into today, that view has been tempered quite a bit. A couple theories I'll mention here are new institutional economics and followed by endogenous growth theories. So new institutional economics is this idea that yes, markets are what we need to generate growth, but markets really exist over a network of institutions, both social, political, and otherwise, that really determine whether or not markets and the rewards that markets give us are going to be distributed amongst our populations, and whether or not growth is actually going to benefit the poor. So policies in this period started to focus more on, or at least somewhat on, incentive structures that are needed within institutions. Good governance has been a particularly large focus, that if we can have governments that really prioritize distributing the benefits of economic development to the poor, we're going to start to see some progress on the development front. And this sort of goes hand in hand with this idea that growth, economic growth, isn't just about the external factors in the market and removing external barriers to the market, but also about the kind of resources that countries have to develop from within, right? So that's human capital. Do they have a skilled labor force to develop their economies? And is there sufficient investment in research and innovation? So there are some clear limits to growth theory, right, that have become increasingly clear in the last few years. These were brought to light, I'd say, first by some of the global movements around anti-globalization that really kicked off in the 1990s and early 2000s, sort of epitomized by the Occupy Wall Street protests. But basically, unfettered markets, we now know, result in inequality. Wealth ends up consolidated at the top. The costs of basic needs goods tend to rise. Social programs are cut. And although unemployment often does decline, so does income inequality. And I'm going to talk for a little bit about this idea of income inequality. For a long time, we believed that if general GDP and GNI grew, right, that poverty would reduce, as I've mentioned. What we now know is that income inequality and growth affect each other. So growth affects the distribution of wealth, and that's a reflexive relationship. And as income inequality grows, often growth does as well, and both inequality and growth affect absolute poverty. And this was an idea that was coined as Bourgnon's triangle, chief economist of the World Bank from 2003 to 2007. And he posited that poverty was a function of both income inequality and growth. And therefore, poverty reduction should focus on limiting inequality and not just focus on unfettered economic growth. So where does that leave us today? So we see here a graph of income inequality in some of the most developed economies in the world. And we see that generally income inequality has been on the rise since the 1970s to today. No surprise probably to most of you that the United States is at the top of that chart, followed closely by the United Kingdom. But what's more surprising, I think, is that some of the most unequal countries in the world, actually all of the most unequal countries in the world, are in the developing world. More than half of them come from sub-Saharan Africa, which is historically been some of the poorest regions of the world and the region of the world where most of these growth policies have really been focused. So we see clearly something is not quite working. And one of the reasons for that, and one of the things that as sociologists we tend to focus on, is this idea that poverty rate is intergenerational. Inequality is passed down. And when we understand inequality as intergenerational, we have to look at what happens during the childhood years. In early childhood, children growing up in poverty tend to be malnourished. They tend to share a disproportionate share of disease. This puts them behind in school from a very early age, even before they enter formal schooling. By the time they enter formal schooling in their primary school years, we find that poor children have inequitable access to schools, if they have access at all, and that those schools have a wide range of quality. During adolescence, we see these problems begin to compound, particularly for young women in adolescence. Early sexual debut leads to early marriage and early childbearing. And again, we see this issue of inequitable access to schools is actually more severe at the secondary level by the time kids are entering adolescence. So with all of this sort of history, by the time kids are getting to transitioning from school to work, we find that it's no surprise that the poorest of the poor are left behind and don't have the same opportunities to access labor markets. They haven't had the chance to develop the same kinds of job readiness skills that their peers have. And so I think one of the reasons that I focus on education, and one of the reasons that education has historically been a large part of global development policy, is because childhood is really the time when we can stop this sort of intergenerational transmission. So education and global policy. Where has education played in the global policy regime? So going back to the 1970s and looking like broadly 1970s to the early 1990s, we're still focused on growth. We're moving now in this period from this idea of free markets to sort of free markets with some constraints and focus on institutions. Global development was really measured by something, at least at the United Nations level, called the Human Development Index. Probably most of you have heard of it. still out there. Basically, the Human Development Index is three things. It's years of schooling, it's life expectancy at birth, and it's per capita GNI. So we see that from the beginning, we've already acknowledged that development is not just about economic growth, that's part of it. It's also a measurement of health, and it's also a measurement of access to education. So leading up to 2000, the world did a pretty extraordinary thing. They set global goals, right, for development for all countries in the world. And this was new, Millennium Development Goals, or the MDGs. Again, I'm sure most of you have read about them, heard about them. You still hear these words in the vernacular. But what was, I think, extraordinary about the Millennium Development Goals was, one, they expanded this idea of global development. So no longer is global development just basic life expectancy. We're talking about a more nuanced understanding of health, right? So it's about eradicating hunger, it's about nutrition, it's about maternal health, it's about combating HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other communicable diseases. And it expanded an understanding of what matters with education. And I'm going to come back to education in a second. Millennium Development Goal 2, with the goal of achieving universal primary education for all children around the world. But it added a few facets that we hadn't thought about yet. So environmental sustainability, gender equality, and women's empowerment, and also this idea of public-private partnerships. Again, a buzzword that's still out there a lot, but this idea that governments can't go it alone, right? That governments require buy-in and partnership, not just from the private sector, but also from civil society organizations. So diving in for a second on MDG 2, the Achieve Universal Primary Education. I want to use this as a case study to talk about global policy and inequality and sort of what happened in the period from 2000 to 2015. So globally, we saw the net enrollment rate of children in primary school increase from 82% to 91%. Now, primary school is defined by the international community as grades 1 through 8. So it's what we know as primary school, elementary school, and middle school. And you might think that 82 to 91% is not a huge jump, but in fact, it's millions of children. In sub-Saharan Africa alone, we saw the net enrollment rate increase from 52% to 78%. And we saw near gender parity enrollment, meaning equal number of girls and boys enrolled at the primary level. And overall, about a 50% reduction in out-of-school children globally. Sounds pretty good, right? So did it really reduce inequality? So it turns out that while MDG 2 did a pretty good job of reducing some inequalities, particularly at the primary level, it actually created other problems. So first off, the 91% net enrollment rate was actually reached by 2007. So halfway through the Millennium Development Goal period, we saw progress start to stagnate, which was concerning and sort of indicates that there's this whole cohort of people that are much harder to reach. So indeed, the poorest children by 2015 were still 4 times as likely to be out of school than others. Or in other words, 21% of children in the poorest quintile are still out of school. And the number of out-of-school children in particularly vulnerable environments, like conflict-affected countries, actually increased from 30 to 36%. And 33 million of the 55 million out-of-school children are actually in sub-Saharan Africa. And more than half of those who are out of school are girls. So clearly, there's something still inequitable happening. And it appeared to the global community, and this was true, that the poorest of the poor were difficult to reach and had not actually been affected, and in some cases perhaps had been harmed by these policies. So we're going to take a closer look at what happened in sub-Saharan Africa, where many of these children are. And a surprising report came out right around 2015 at the Brookings Institution Center for Universal Education. They released a report. It's a tool you can still find online called the African Learning Barometer. I encourage you to visit the website. You can look country by country. They have a really great tool. It turns out that 40% of the children who entered school weren't learning. So in other words, almost half of the kids that had entered primary school didn't graduate primary school being able to read and write. And that gender inequality at the secondary school level had actually increased and gotten worse in many countries. We see that just 53% of kids are completing primary school, even though we see much higher levels of net enrollment, and less than 28% are enrolling in secondary school compared to almost in sub-Saharan Africa, compared to 60% in Asia and almost 71% in Latin America. And then finally, less than 6% in sub-Saharan Africa go on to higher education, compared to much higher levels again in other continents and part of the world. So I spent about 6 years working in Malawi, which is a small, tiny little country most folks have never heard of in southern Africa. And Malawi is an interesting case study, I think, for what happened at the secondary school level with regards to education. And just to give you all a sort of lay of the land and what that felt like, I'm actually going to ask you to bear with me through a little thought experiment. Can I have you all stand up? Sorry for putting down your computers and shuffling things. I won't make you move, but stand up. All right, so we're going to imagine just for a minute that all of you are 18-year-old Malawian girls. It'll be easier for some of you than others. And today, for 18-year-old Malawian girls, we're going to demonstrate sort of what the stats look like in terms of secondary education achievement. So I want everybody on this half of the room to sit down. Your education was over before it began. You were married off or bearing children well before the age of 18. Of the half of you that are still standing, I'm going to draw an imaginary line here with Kanan at the front. This half sit down. Yes. You all completed primary school, but never enrolled in secondary school, either because you failed your 8th grade examination, your parents could afford to pay the school fees, maybe there wasn't a secondary school close enough for you to attend. We find in Malawi often kids are walking 12 kilometers or more each way just to get to school. And of those of you that are left, I'm gonna split this group like this. You guys stay over there. I'd like this half to sit down. So you, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, finish secondary school. You complete all 4 years. Those of you that just sat down, dropped out because either you stopped being able to afford the fees, you failed out, perhaps you had to take wage-based employment in order to help your families. So of you 5 still standing, I want you 3 in the back to sit. Only you 2 graduate. So we have a situation in Malawi where 6% of women, if this room was the total of the Malawian female population, just these 2 would have finished high school, which is 6% of women. Thank you. And I like to walk folks through that because I think it really drives home the idea that if we're talking about inequality, in places like Malawi, and Malawi is not alone on the continent for looking that way in terms of its secondary education statistics, we have to be talking about access to education. Okay, so what's next? So we realized, the global community to some degree, right, that there had been this mistake, that the exclusive focus on enrollment in primary education had caused some gross inequities at the secondary level, that it had failed to recognize that schooling quality is also important, right? That kids aren't even, it doesn't matter if kids are sitting in school if they're not actually learning. So what happened in the making of the Sustainable Development Goals that tried to address this? And I was fortunate enough to be in Washington, D.C. and participating in this process as it was unfolding. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about how that happened. And then we can talk about whether or not it was good. So in 2012, as the world is coming to terms with these realities. And it wasn't just MDG 2 that had issues, right? There were lots of acknowledgements across the board about the failures of the Millennium Development Goals and some successes. So in the education space, the UN Secretary General at the time, Ban Ki-moon, launched something called the Global Education First Initiative, which was the task force that was put in place to address the inequities that we saw in education globally and help craft the next policy agenda. So there were three main goals. One, put every child in school. Two, improve the quality of learning, because we saw what happened when we didn't pay attention to that. And three, and this is an interesting twist, foster global citizenship. So there starts to be this acknowledgement that success for kids and people and countries, right, isn't just about do kids finish school and do they acquire basic literacy and numeracy skills, but do they have the skills that are required to, one, compete and participate in the global economy, to be active citizens in their countries, and to contribute to development in other ways. So the Global Education First Initiative was made up of a high-level panel on education. That's what it was called, the high-level panel. Everybody referred to it as the high-level panel. And it was led by the special envoy, who was the former Prime Minister of the UK, Gordon Brown, who has a particular interest and love of education, for those of you who didn't know. There were UN agencies represented on the high-level panel, the World Bank, the Global Partnership for Education, which is the sort of most famous public-private partnership on education, also housed at the World Bank. A few of the biggest private sector donors in education, and I don't mean USAID, I mean folks like the Hewlett Foundation, MasterCard Foundation, some of the big players. NGOs, again, large names like Save the Children, Care International, and few civil society organizations, and about 16 country governments. And together, the high-level panel appointed and put in place a task force housed at the Brookings Institution called the Learning Metrics Task Force, which was a technical working group whose job it was to actually develop the next global agenda, send their recommendations up to the high-level panel, and have those incorporated into the final Sustainable Development Goal agenda. So who was the Learning Metrics Task Force? There were about 186 members of the technical working group, and they were made up of NGOs, again, the big players, private donors, a surprising number of private donors, again, mostly private foundations, bilateral and multilateral aid agencies. Hopefully everyone knows bilaterals are like USAID, DFID, government-to-government aid agencies, and multilaterals are the World Bank, IMF, and country governments. And in an effort to be more inclusive, the Learning Metrics Task Force convened three different consultations for the general populace, asking for global input on what should be prioritized on the agenda. So we saw teachers, students, education experts, and around 50 ministers of education actually participate in the consultation process. And the biggest thing that came out of the Learning Metrics Task Force in the first year was a report which sought to define quality education. What do we mean by quality? Do we just mean that kids can read and write and do mathematics on grade level? Or going back to this idea that global citizenship skills are important, both for schooling and employment and development, what do kids need to be learning in school beyond that? And they actually identified 7 different domains of learning that are critically important and that they said we should be measuring success against. So science and technology, numeracy and mathematics, learning approaches and cognition. These are things like critical thinking skills, strategic thinking, literacy and communication, culture and the arts, social and emotional learning competencies, which that's actually a favorite of mine because I actually think this is one of the most important, but the way that it's framed never comes out that way. Social and emotional learning competencies for them were things like self-esteem, self-efficacy, agency. What are the soft skills that students need in order to succeed? And then physical well-being. So what did they accomplish? So one, As I mentioned, Learning Metrics Task Force defined quality education and learning. They identified how quality education should be measured, and they actually, through their technical working group, identified the indicators that would do the measurement. And they made these recommendations to the UN, to the high-level panel for consideration and incorporation into the Sustainable Development Goals. And for the most part, most of their recommendations were adopted. Some of these other learning domains got dropped, but generally we see across the board reflected in the current SDGs that 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are all sort of represented. So the Sustainable Development Goal agenda, we had 8 Millennium Development Goals. We have 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Again, we start to see a much more nuanced understanding of issues around the environment, health, poverty. We still only have 1 on education though, but that's cool. If we take a little bit of a closer look on what that goal says, it actually wraps up a number of things into one. So here are the high-level targets. You'll note a few important changes from the Millennium Development Goals. First, when we're talking about all girls and boys complete free and equitable quality primary and secondary education. So that's a significant shift from the Millennium Development Goal, the first Millennium Development Goal. 2, we're talking about eliminating gender disparities in education and again, ensuring equal access to all levels of education. So implying that not just primary school is important, but secondary school is important, as is tertiary, meaning university. And 3, ensuring that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development. So all of those 7 domains of learning are wrapped up here in target 3. And each of these targets have a number of indicators associated with them that are being monitored and tracked at the global level. Okay, so that's the current policy regime. I want to take a second and talk just a little bit about a different form of inequality. So we've talked a lot about inequality within countries and how that really is a huge barrier to positive and sustainable development. I want to also talk about inequality of process and what's happening in the discourse between local actors and the global aid community. And this will lead into my research here towards the end. Okay, so here's a little chart which shows a breakdown of the percent of global aid going to education around the world from the different sources. Multilaterals, no surprise. Multilaterals and bilaterals by far have the biggest share of foreign aid, followed by private foundations and corporations. So I thought that this is a surprising statistic given what we've seen in terms of education being prioritized as one of the benchmarks for success from the time of the 1970s. And yet we still see a surprisingly small amount of foreign aid going into the education sector. Further, there's another phenomenon, another thing happening in the global education space. So here are some quotes from some of the biggest funders right now in international education. Most recently, the Obama Foundation launched an initiative called the Global Girls Initiative. So there's this focus from all of the donors, right, about scale and scalability. And on the one hand, this makes a lot of sense, right? We have a global set of goals that are very ambitious. We're looking at achieving target levels of schooling and schooling quality across the world. So scalable solutions at face value make a lot of sense. I would argue, though, that when it comes to education, in particular, that the specifics of culture, social context, economies, actually change dramatically what's required for successful education, right? And so this narrative around scale and scalability being a priority has actually been driven, again, by the global community with very little input from local actors on the ground. So in this sort of milieu of global education donors, we still see that just 0.2% of all international aid goes to local NGOs. And presumably, and you'll see this also mentioned in global development reports across the board, that presumably local actors and local NGOs are the ones who know best. They're the ones who know best their context. They're the ones who understand the intricacies of culture and need better than folks coming in from the outside. But yet the money doesn't flow. So I want to take a minute and sort of end with a brief discussion of the research that I'm doing in East Africa, which seeks to address this particular inequality, which is about inequality of process and which actors have a seat at the table. So I'm working with a consortium of organizations, and I'll talk about them more in a minute. But specifically, the consortium, or the collective, has come together to address three big global development challenges. The first being that local solutions are often overlooked for scalable programs delivered mostly by large NGOs. Two, that there are no measurement scales that take local specificity into account. You just heard me narrate to you how the indicators to measure quality education were developed at the global level, and this one set of indicators is supposed to be deployed in every country, right? And three, that local organizations are best suited to understand the challenges of education, but they often don't have a seat at the global policy table. And from my personal experience being involved in the Sustainable Development Goals, I can say that that's true. That while there were opportunities here and there for smaller organizations to participate, you had to have a seat in Washington, D.C., or at least have access to Washington, D.C., which cuts out the majority of local actors. And even if you had that seat as a small organization, your voice often wasn't valued. So AMPLIFY is the name of this collective called the AMPLIFY Girls Network. They're a group of 18 community-driven organizations across Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. They mostly have budgets less than $500,000, so that's sort of the size of their work. They're headed and founded by local leaders, all of them, mostly from the communities where they're still working. They're all girl-serving, and they're focused on this sort of realm of expanding the definition of quality education to include a set of soft skills. And I'll get to agency in a minute. Their mission is to shift the development paradigm to one of community-driven collaboration. So the question is, how are we going to do that? So the number one priority of AMPLIFY, this is where my research comes in, is to develop a set of shared metrics. They want to develop locally specific measurement tool, a local framework for understanding program design, and be able to measure the impact of that local framework for program design. So the idea being that if AMPLIFY, as a group of 18 organizations, can demonstrate collective impact, that might give them a seat at the table with some of these larger players. And then two, they're working on a global advocacy and policy platform, again, based on this shared metrics idea, that if they have demonstrated impact, that will hopefully get the attention of some of these larger actors. So how did we do it? So we used, to develop a shared set of metrics with 18 organizations operating in 4 countries, some in rural, some in urban, very different ethnic, religious backgrounds, was quite an undertaking. We used a process called group concept mapping. Some of you might have heard of it. It's developed by a faculty member actually here at Cornell named Bill Trocham originally. So basically we asked organizations to answer the question, what does success look like for girls in your community? And they gave us a list of answers to that. Each of these dots on the page is actually one response to that question. We then asked the organizations to sort these answers conceptually into categories that made sense to them. So we gave them a list of 100 answers to the question, what does success look like for girls? And they sorted them into piles, literally. We then took that sort data, which is all qualitative data now, and we quantitatively analyzed it using a multivariate statistical technique called multidimensional scaling, which effectively creates a visual geography of how these ideas relate to each other. So we see that points on one side of the map are less conceptually linked to points on the other side. You see over here, statement 5 is girls have diverse employment opportunities, and that is on the far side of the map from statement 46, which is girls are proud of who they are. Then we took all of those statements and using hierarchical cluster analysis grouped them into clusters of statements and categorized them. So generally we ended up with 4 broad outcome areas that set the stage for our shared metrics conversation with AMPLIFY. Economic empowerment, formal schooling and education, girls' health and freedom, and last and definitely not least, girls' agency and leadership. And the stacks here are actually the way that organizations prioritized each of these outcome areas. So at the very end, we asked them to tell us which of these outcome areas are most important to you and your work. And across the board, we saw that girls' agency and leadership was consistently the most important outcome area for organizations. So that leaves us with the problem of how do we measure agency and how do we define agency? Agency is one of those sort of nebulous terms, right, that encompasses lots of things and has been defined a million different ways. So we developed a shared understanding of what agency means. And we did that a couple ways. I surveyed the literature in human development, global development, gender and empowerment, looking for a common definition. And we sort of overlaid that with an understanding of what organizations had actually written right here in this cluster of things that we called girls' agency and leadership. And it turns out that the literature and organizations generally agreed that agency is 2 things. On the one hand, it's a set of positive self-beliefs, things like self-efficacy, self-confidence, empowerment, self-esteem. And while these self-beliefs might vary a little bit from place to place, generally there's a set of them that most organizations could agree on are important for their girls. So this is a universally important thing. But it's not enough, right, to just believe in your own ability to set goals and achieve them. That's the definition of self-efficacy. You actually have to have the skills to be able to do the goal achievement. You can't just believe it if you can't actually do it. So the second thing that's really important are skills. And we hypothesized, and partners of AMPLIFY later confirmed, that the skills that actually are needed in each community context are going to be really different depending upon the country, depending upon whether they're urban or rural, depending upon the cultural linguistic context. And it turns out that partners agreed, and that is also true. So we are defining agency in the context of this research as a set of positive self-perceptions combined with a set of skills. And we worked on developing a survey that would take this into account and take into account the fact that the specific skills of interest are going to vary from place to place. So our final survey tool, which we developed actually the last few weeks, combines these 3 positive self-beliefs with these 13 skills that partners identified as important for girls in their communities. We then are going to weight each of these skills according to a weighted average that partners give us. They're going to tell us, in my context, leadership is the most important thing and perseverance is the least important. And that will give us a final score for agency. So we are planning to measure local impact by using agency as one of our key outcomes and measuring the impact of local program design, not just on agency, but also on education, economic empowerment, livelihoods, and health. So I want to leave a few minutes for questions at the end. In conclusion, I'll just say that first of all, thanks for bearing with me from the super broad to the super specific. But when we're talking about global inequality or we're talking about inequality in development, it's equally as important to consider process as it is to consider what's actually happening within countries and within communities. And I think that's a lesson that regardless of what sector you're working in, whether it's education or agriculture or health, that's a lesson that I think we all could take to heart. So thanks. I'll take a few questions if we have time.